So the fun thing is that like Bo, I'm actually on sabbatical too, but these sort of things are, I don't really count these sort of things as work. So, you know, but so as a result, I'm just kind of like, okay, no, we're here, we're having fun, we're talking, you know, as it goes. So yeah. Make sure those are the right notes. There we go. As I got the sermon for, you know, the church later. So this has been pretty fun. So how are we all this morning?
Good.
Glad to be here.
Beautiful day.
Good, good. Like, are people online? Are they?
There's no one online right now.
Okay. All right. So, but let me know when there is, just so because then like you know, multimedia thing, then I can make sure to address the people in the ether. So yeah, no. So like you know, as part of you know, I was talking with Bo about this for, you know, quite a while. And we were talking about this kind of these notions of creativity, these rhythms of that, and that's something that's always particularly interested me. And I think a little bit from it's something I'm going to preach about, you know, on the main pulpit, but also here there's a little bit of opportunity to kind of focus a little bit focus on you know, the theme. And one of the things I was thinking about was creation, really. You know, we don't usually think about creation that very often, primarily because I think it's primarily because of modernity. There's a little bit of sense of modernism, you know, and that sense of materialism, you know, like people just, we look around, right? Like things exist, you know, the mesa exists, you know, the trees exist. But you think about Durango, even as a town, you know, it was created. You know, there are houses here. I don't know if any of you ever seen, you know, pictures of the old town. There were no trees here. There's no trees here because in the West, they just, cottonwoods and these elms, things like that, they didn't exist at the time out here. Like, so all these trees are descendants of trees that people brought here. Why did they do that? Well, there was this notion that when people were building towns, they wanted to make it like home. So when people moved from Ohio or New York or New Jersey, or they came from England or all over the place, they brought their own trees. If you looked at the river also didn't have trees by it. You know, it was like if you came here before, there would have been grasses about waist high, you know, and there would have been like, you know, the agave, you know, all those sort of things. It was a very different looking landscape. There would have been junipers, there would have been like some cedars, but it just wasn't like that. So we think about town, we think about, like, I was just getting on my car this morning, right? Oh gosh, it's beautiful. This car, like getting out, it was like beautiful, like, because the trees are nice, the trees have like a cooling effect, the light, you know, circles through them, and it became like this perfect illustration. Like, this is what creation is like. This is how things are transformed. It became a place that, like, you look at the old pictures, it's a very Western town, you know, clapboard walls, you know, wood walls, whitewashed, it just, you know, sun beating down on them, and they turned it into something different. I think part of that is, why did they do that? It's like, well, we do things like that because we want to transform things, and to think about creation as this kind of act of transformation, turning something that just is into something that's beautiful. I'm just looking at my notes right there. So I got this video that I'm going to play for you. I'm just like, as we're improvising the AV here, so like I said, I'm on sabbatical, so. But there's this recreation of this conversation between J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. This is when Lewis was an atheist at the time, but this is basically the gist of their conversation. So it's about 10 minutes, no, about 8 minutes, but I wanted to kind of like show this, and then wanted to kind of have a little bit of a roundtable, have a little bit of discussion about it. So,
fairy stories, which I think is rather ridiculous. After all, the magic of myths or fairy stories is not an end in itself. It exists to serve virtue.
can you?
Satisfy certain primordial human desires. Fairy stories, which I think is rather ridiculous. After all, the magic of myths or fairy stories is not an end in itself. It exists to serve virtue. It satisfies certain primordial human desires. But myths are fiction. The stories they tell aren't true.
Tolkien's with the pipe.
Therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver.
Can we turn it up a little bit?
Beautiful lies. You can't seriously
I'm with
believe
you.
fairy tales. Why not? I can, in fact, I do. But this is preposterous. How can you seriously believe a lie? Oh, Jack, myths are not lies. In fact, they're the very opposite of a lie. Myths convey the essential truth, the primal reality of life itself. Go on. Well, you see, we have been duped into using the word myth as being synonymous with a lie, because we have been duped into accepting the first real lie of materialism. And what is that? That is the hideous claim that there is no supernatural order to the universe. The materialists have imprisoned us in a world of mere matter, of physical facts, divorced from and devoid of metaphysical truth. Well, I say that they're lying. I say that they are the ones who have come up with a false myth. Their world doesn't exist. It's merely a figment of their imagination. Well, fine. However, there's a problem. The problem is they've convinced us that it is true. They have made us believe that this is all there is. 3 dimensions, 5 senses, 4 walls. Isn't it? Most emphatically not. Jack, the 4 walls of materialism are the 4 walls of a prison. And the materialists are our jailers. Don't you see? They've put us in a prison of 4 walls. They don't want us to see what's beyond those walls. They don't want us to discover what lies outside their narrow philosophy. Worse than that, they think that any attempt to escape from the prison is an act of treason. Well, wouldn't it be an act of treason against rationality to believe otherwise? Now, Jack, think for a moment. How can it be wrong for a prisoner to think of things that exist other than walls or jailers? Doesn't the fact that the prisoner is able to think of things outside the walls suggest that perhaps things do exist outside the walls? After all, if the prison really is all there is, how are we able to picture things that exist beyond the prison? This is where myths come in, you see. Myths exist outside the prison. Myths allow us to escape from the prison. Or if we are not able to escape, at the very least, they allow us to catch a fleeting but oh so powerful glimpse of the beauty that lies beyond the walls. But what is it that we're meant to be glimpsing? Well, don't you see the truth, Jack? Myths show us a fleeting glimpse of truth itself. Truth. Truth. What on earth is this truth that you're talking about? Ah, quid est veritas? What is truth? I'm glad to see that you've entered into the spirit of the myth, Jack. You've just cast yourself into the role of pilot. Pilot? Oh, I see. You're able to believe in the lesser myths because you've already accepted the big one. Well, once you accept the big myth, the lie of Christ, it's easy to accept the smaller ones. Right, Hopkins, I'll play the role of pilot. I'll wash my hands of the whole nonsense. Well, Jack, you may be able to wash your hands, but your mind is still muddied. You're not thinking clearly at all, old chap. You're acting as if myths are mere arbitrary inventions of fiction, as if we pull them out of thin air. But what you don't understand is that we make things by the law in which we are made. We create because we are created. Creativity. Imagination is God's imageness in us. We tell stories because God is a storyteller. In fact, He's the storyteller. We tell our stories with words. He tells His story with history. The facts of history are His words, and providence is His storyline.
Are you suggesting that all of history, that everything around us is all part of some divine myth?
We are all part of his story. This very conversation is part of his story.
Perhaps it isn't his story, perhaps it's only your story. How can you know that your story, the story that you believe, the Christian story, is any more real than the other story?
But don't you see, it isn't my story, it's his story. You're acting as if Christianity is one myth among many. It's not, it's the true myth. Christianity really happened. Jesus really existed, so did Pilate. And yet it is this true story that makes sense of all the other stories. It is the archetype. It is the story in which all the other stories have their source, and the story to which all the other stories point. It has everything. It has catastrophe and its opposite, what we might call eucatastrophe. It has the joy of the happy ending, the sudden joyous turn in the story that is essential to all myths. It has, to a sublime degree, this joy of deliverance, this evangelium, this fleeting glimpse of the real joy, to which all other joys are but a distant echo.
Tell us, what did you mean by catastrophe and eucatastrophe?
For example, it has the catastrophe of the fall, the eucatastrophe of the redemption. It has the catastrophe of the crucifixion, and the eucatastrophe of the resurrection. It has everything man's heart desires, because it is being told by the one who is the fulfillment of desire itself. It's a story that begins and ends in joy.
But just because a story brings joy, it doesn't necessarily follow that it's true. There are many joyful myths. They all seem rather flimsy to me, and ring rather false.
And yet this story has the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits.
Perhaps it's just very well written artifice.
This story has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, not fiction, but of creation. And to reject this leads either to darkness or to wrath. And in my own life, it has led me from darkness to light.
Astonishing. Tell us you astonish me. You absolutely astonish me.
So in poetics, you know, when you're reading poetry, you're telling a story, you gotta let things land. You gotta wait at least like 5 seconds. Because you give people a chance to absorb, you know. Oh yeah, you gotta love the YouTube ads. It's worthwhile. I pay for the premium account, so it's like it's worth paying for. Your life gets infinitely easier without ads. But with that, what are some things that stuck out to people? Just popcorn. I like to have. I never mind being the lecturer. I never mind being the chief conversationalist. But I want this to be kind of open. So what were some of the things that just stuck out to people? Who what were things that were just very beautiful, or kind of, or like what, or like that's. I'm curious about that. Like
They were able to talk even though they had totally different ideas.
Right? That's the thing about that sort of conversation. Exactly.
The concept of God as a storyteller is one that just sort of hit me. Still thinking about it.
I think when we think about God as a storyteller, it's one of those things where we're very used to a very theological vision of God. I have nothing wrong with theology. It's a wonderful think it's Corey Ten Boom put it, it's a wonderful science, right? It's a wonderful science for the believers, for the faithful, that, there's ways that we can figure out how things are actually done. But I think because of too much of it, like there's a famous meme where it's Jesus asking like one of the disciples, like who do you say that I am? And it's like you are the living incarnation of the Tetragrammaton from the very, and it just kind of the Paraclete, et cetera. Then Jesus is like, what? And that's primarily because we're a little bit removed. We're a little bit removed from the original cultures that talked about God. So in the video, Tolkien describes it as primary art. Like, why does he describe it that way? Well, when we think about scripture, we have to remember that it wasn't necessarily written in our language. And when I've come to these Sunday school, I've taught. I think last time I was here a couple years back, pre-pandemic, we were talking a little bit about translations. And Greek is a very terse language, and most of the Gospels were written in Greek. But the Hebrew people, they're kind of a lot more like Native American. Their language is very complicated, very tonal, and very much in a different sort of tense. So when we think about those sort of things, it's easy for the narrative to get lost. But the thing is, if we read the Hebrew Bible, and if you read it in with its emotions, you get the sense of how joyful God, Yahweh, is when He creates the world. Like the lines, where He says, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. We're used to that kind of English. It's like, oh, okay, that's the beginning of the story. But if you think about it, it's supposed to be kind of you can imagine like how someone would have told that story. Probably would have been told like around a fire, or have been told in like a ceremony, or have been told there, and where someone was saying, in the beginning, you're supposed to add to it. It's not necessarily meant. It's basically when you read Native American myth today, it seems a little bit strange. Just because it seems kind of terse, right? It's like, oh, beaver went over here, he grabbed some earth, or like he threw it into the water, and then that's how the continent showed up. And people read it like that. Oh, that's how Native American storytelling works. Like, no, that was basically someone was just recording it, because you add in the full details. The artistry is in adding, all those full-on details. So if I was telling that first Genesis account, you basically say, in the beginning, there wasn't anything. There was darkness, there was roaring waters with nothing to hear, no sound, there was no stars, there was no light, everything was twisted and whirled around, and there was just no sense of anything. But then the Spirit of God flew like an eagle over the waters, and then suddenly He spoke and He said, "Let there be light." And there was light, and He saw that it was good. And you keep doing that, you add in, there's a layer of beauty that comes with it. I think about that. I think one of my favorite things about the video is that they imply that is the beautifulness of the story as well. Other thoughts or responses, or
Well, there was other stuff going on. I heard somewhere, some class, that Miriam, Moses' sister, when they were relating this stuff, she was dancing around and her hands were going and singing, and it doesn't come through in the Bible.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the other very good examples is David, in his story, right? We don't think of David. We always think of David, oh, conquering hero, right? We're used to that, right? Conquering hero, messes up, all those sort of things. We're used to kind of a Bible school sort of vision of the Bible, but in some ways that kind of separates us from the primariness of it. Think about who David is. Think about, if you look at the story, think about who he is. So Saul was chosen to be king because he was a big man. He was big, he was handsome, he had demonstrated some leadership abilities, fighting abilities, a person you would normally expect, nominated for king. And he doesn't do a very good job of it. So God dispatches Samuel, to Bethlehem to talk to, to find David. The thing is what David's name means. So think about it. David is the last born son. He has multiple brothers who are all probably pretty strong, pretty forceful in personality, bright, all of this. but he's the youngest son. His name, Hebraic names are also meant to be blessing. His name means literally much loved one. What does he do all day? Well, he takes care of the sheep. I don't know if you've ever taken care of sheep, but it's a pretty lonely job. You're out there, but it's also, a lot of people like that sort of work because you're out where no one is going to bother you. So he's out there and he has a harp, and that's what he does all day. He just sings, like, he's out there singing to the sheep. It describes that he has, very beautiful eyes. He has a good look about him. And there's also the sense in the story that he's chosen because he's creative. But he's also brave because he has to take care of the sheep. And we're used to a very soft vision of what shepherds are. But in the context and the storytelling, this kid is like, he kills bears. Most of us were told, oh yeah, shoo the bear away, or our first instinct is not to fight. But if you're protecting livestock, you have to fight. And he just does this. So the thing is, you're beginning to see that David is someone who is both very, very strong, very, very powerful, even as a young man, but who is also immeasurably gentle and creative. Isn't that just a wonderful image right there? Lewis writes in an essay. It's called "The Necessity of Chivalry," one of his very best. And people are kind of rediscovering this because, there's all these questions about, like, well, what are men, what are people supposed to do? And the idea behind chivalry, this notion we're used to, like, he describes, we're so used to thinking, chivalry is like, opening the doors in cars or churches, for women. That's where most of us just conceive it as. But medieval people viewed it as, it's actually turning your life into art. Thinking of and conceiving of your life as artwork. The sense that I can be as violent, as strong, as brutal as I need to be to protect the people that I care about, whether it's the church, the people, against the dragon, all that sort of thing. But I can also be supremely gentle, supremely clear. I think about that often because I think it adds that element of choice back into the story. Like when we're used to, part of the thing about modernity is that we're all adrift in forces that we can't really control. That's the argument. That's the argument really behind modernity. It's not my fault because it's either biology, it was technology, determinism, like, it's not my fault. That's essentially, if you boil down modern ethics, that's really what it is. It's not my fault. It was so-and-so's fault. But medieval man is like, no, that's your decision. Because I think when we think about art, we usually think, oh, someone's drawing a pretty picture. But it's our response to creation. We've been created. How do we respond? So other thoughts. We're kind of like, I think they called this back in the 60s a rap session.
I was real intrigued by the age difference between Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And I'm, years ago, having read C.S. Lewis and several of his. So, yeah, he was seeking, right? I mean, he wasn't a believer yet. He said he's during his period of, being a non-believer. Anyway, it was just interesting to watch their interaction. He was very open to what Tolkien had to do. It seemed definitely like Tolkien was preaching to him, and all this conversation about myth, and I'm not sure I understood it all, but it was very interesting. It seemed to be one of the main themes they were talking about. Myth, this being a myth, and myth versus reality.
Right.
Anyway, that's.
So there's first off, there's just some really hilarious. My favorite moment in the Lewis Tolkien friendship was actually when they met. They were both veterans from the war. They both returned to Oxford. That was where their alma maters, and they basically had Tolkien had already completed his graduate work and Lewis had just finished his. And they met, like basically the English department was meeting for the first time. And we have their letters, and we have their journals from what they thought of the meeting. And Tolkien was very much annoyed when he met Lewis, like, who's this big Irishman in these big checkered pants, you know, it was kind of like, who is that? And then Lewis's response to Tolkien is like, you know, reedy fellow, pretty bright, just needs a good beating. You know, but they were very good friends because of their love of Norse mythology. And I think like to that point of like mythology, right, made of truth. Tolkien wrote that mythology. He was pretty broad in his definition, but he said that all mythology, you know, no matter how separate from Christian understanding, you know, what we consider that, is all made of truth. And I think that's a really good paradigm. That's a really good way to think about it, because I think most of the time we're thinking about, is that story true? Well, if we were thinking about it, each other's stories, we all know that, okay, of course their story is true in some way, you know, because they've lived it. It's a lie, right? So a good example of like mythology being truth is Norse mythology. Norse mythology is usually viewed of as the least Christian of mythologies, and there's quite a few people who've kind of I would say misappropriated it, you know, primarily like white supremacists or like cultists, you know, or occultists, basically say, oh, that's you know, that's really what human religion is supposed to be, you know. It's, you know, they use it kind of as a you know, as a tool for brutality. There's a lot of memes online of these folks are like, oh yeah, well, at least our God wasn't you know, nailed up on a tree. My response to that, because they're talking about Thor, right? And my response is, well, at least our God is not stupid. And Thor is usually portrayed as being fairly stupid in the most stringent of the stories. However, this is interesting because that was actually how Tolkien and Lewis bonded, is that they both loved Norse mythology. And we wonder why, right? It's like, oh, like these are preeminent Christian men. I mean, it makes sense for Lewis, who was an atheist at the time, but Tolkien had been, you know, a Christian, Catholic, you know, ever since he was a youth, and he still loved it. But why? Well, there's a line that comes from only if you study it really intensely. So it's what the Vikings called the Milky Way. The Milky Way in Norse, it literally translates to the gallows of the awesome one. Because in the Norse story, Odin, you know, he hung himself in order to like kind of die and to gain wisdom. But if you think about it, if you think about this terminology, you even see the beginning. You see a Christian echo. You see an echo of the one true God. You see an echo of Yahweh. What do you think about that? Like, you know, the Norse thought of the Milky Way as essentially the cross. It was there. It was already there. That's what they mean by like myth is mostly made of truth. There's examples of this all across the line. So, okay, I'm going into like storytelling mode. So, and this is part of a very long sequence of myths. So I'm going to tell you an abbreviated one. Like these are ones, you know, people didn't have movies in the old days, so you had a very long story. But there's these eight Lakota virgins, you know, maidens, and they wanted to marry star warriors. That's what the Lakota people believe that the stars are, is that they're essentially people. You know, they're essentially people. They're the people that came before, and they watch over us. Like what we see from below, looking up, is their fires. And they wanted to marry these star warriors, so they went to the heart of everything that is. That's Black Elk Peak in South Dakota. You know, it's very high, it's very isolated. So they went up there and they ascended, like they floated up into the sky and they ascended and they married their star warriors. But one of them started to miss her mother a lot, you know, and so she went over, and there was this root that was sticking out of the ground, and they said, if you don't pick that root, because if not, it'll drop you down to earth. So she pulled it, and she fell. You know, it was like the trap door opened, and she fell, and she fell, and she fell, and she fell, and she fell. She fell, and she hit the ground, but she was still alive. And the thing was, she was pregnant. And before she died, she was able to give birth to the baby. And the baby, they just knew this woman had come from the sky. And when she fell, it looked like a falling star. So the people, they raised the baby, and the baby was very strange because he knew things. He knew things even when he was young. He would tell the elders about the way things really were, and then he said, like, I tell you these things. I tell you these things. And he told them how to paint, sacred symbols on their teepees, on their lodges to protect them, to do the right ceremonies in order to, to be forgiven for things, in order to pray right, all this. And he was just like that. And he kept saying almost every day of his life, it's like, I tell you these things because soon I must return to my Father. And then eventually the day came where he did. He eventually did return to his father. And then there, the Starbanes who, they mourned the loss of their friend. And so they decided to become like a symbol. And if you looked at it, you'd be able to always tell where you were. He took his mother's place. And that's our story of the North Star. That's the story of the North Star. And he said, I will return. So it's the North Star and what we call the Big Dipper. And that's the thing about it is that it adds beauty to the story. It adds meaning. But just because it was obviously invented, it was probably invented by, someone, but it's still made of truth. The notion that, those stars just aren't, like the Big Dipper. It's not just, it's like a random pattern of stars in the sky. Rather, there's an apparatus for meaning behind it, and then the North Star as well. And I think about those lines often because if you talk to the oldest of old timers, they'll tell it exactly how I said it right there. Those words are specific. When he said, I must return to my Father. Other translations have it as, I must return to my Father above. But he said, I also will return. When the people are in trouble, when the people are in bad shape, he will come back because he was raised among us. Now, how does that sound as familiarity?
Well, another example of that is with our Navajo friends. Even the very strong Christians still will talk about some of the Navajo origin myths, and they see no dichotomy between the two. They will talk about, for instance, the creation story of the Navajo and the creation story out of the Christian tradition. And they say, well, they both say the same thing, that, we have emerged from the earth is our mother, and that God has, imbued us with a certain spirit. And we tend to categorize those, there's either this or this. And yet for them, there's not that sense of division.
I think another good example of that, especially when it comes to, I think, like, Christian understanding of myth. I think a good example is the Pueblo people. Like their sacred spaces, where they have ceremony, where they have like these religious connections, where they tell these sort of stories is a kibbutz, right? Circular thing underground, which is about as unchristian as you can kind of think it, right? Like we like our buildings square. They gotta be square for, whatever reason, right? Like that's a real building and it's above, right? And usually like when people came, it's like, the example, right? Well, Jesus always obviously was teaching on a hill, or it's always in the open. But if we think about even our story, right? Even the Christian story, right? Well, where does man come from? We read Genesis, right? It's like, okay, how did the first man, red earth? That's what Adam means, Adam, red earth. What does it mean? Well, it says like, okay, we read it literally. It says God formed him from the dust, the dust in the ground, right? He formed him, right? And then he breathed, into his nose and he became alive. He became a living person, right? Now, most people read that as absurd. It's like, there's something really beautiful about that, right? Because like scientifically, I think it was really funny, right? Because like everyone is like, oh yeah, obviously there's no God. It's like, man from dust, that makes no sense. But we look at the more scientists look at the history of the cosmos, right? It's like, okay, so complex materials like iron, all these things, they're only formed when stars explode. So it means gold is like that as well. All the other elements that form are as a star's main sequence, as in its fusion sequence, it dies, it blows up. That's where all these elements come from. So therefore, science has just proved that man does come from dust. Right? But the thing is, going back to the Kiva, I brought that up because the Pueblos basically worded exactly like that. The Kiva's in the ground because that's where we come from. It's essentially it's a structure of rebirth. It's the same with the Lakota Sweat Lodge. It's the same thing. You know, you're essentially being reborn. That's the thing. Like, you know, he who wishes to follow must be born again. Right? We think about the mythology, right? So as we're kind of how much time do we have?
2 minutes.
Okay. So I'm gonna like wrap us up, but with a very familiar scripture. But I would encourage you to read this in the mythological lens. So I'm improvising here. So a man named conquers the people, came at night to creator sets free, Jesus, at secret at night. He was one of the separated ones. So the thing is, here's the thing. Here's the line. So we all know this, Jesus is talking to him, right? But the thing is that it's how he responds. It's how like he tells what's going on, is because the thing is, we're used to thinking of religion as this is what you do. This is like, these are the rules, right? That's how we conceptualize it. But this mythological framework, if we look at it that way, it's really, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. If we think about it, if we conceive it more in those terms, as we're living out this story, when we're praying to Jesus, we're entering into God's story. Our story is aligning with Creator's story. The thing is that sometimes we can get so religious, we can get so focused on being religious or being spiritual that we can totally miss God. And I think the way that we prevent this is we are reminded that it is a story, that our actions, everything that we do, has significance. It has power. And it has power not because it's like super like, you know, like overriding, but rather because it gives us this meaning, this dignity. You know, it's really beautiful, right? Because there's no person who's unimportant. We think about that, right? Like one of the great creators, right, is like Shakespeare. You think about all of his characters. All of them mean something. Some of them will have like one line, but dang, that was a good line. So let's just take a moment. Let's just take a moment to pray. Let me pray over you as we end this time. Jesus, whose name means creator sets free, I just thank you for this this chance to talk this morning, to hear the reenacted words of two men that loved you very much and were very great storytellers. And they wanted to tell your story. They wanted to tell your story. They wanted people not only to be delighted, which I think you want for us to be, but also to know the truth, to guide them and to do good things. And that's what we need in this world. There's just so much hardship, so much pain. But we're told in your story that you know what that is because you walked among us. I just thank you for everything that you've done and that's how much you care for us. Just pray for the upcoming service. Just pray for everyone who is not here, everyone who will be watching this recording. Just pray this, Lord. We just seal this in your name, your blood, in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Amen.